Our people, remote First Nations, deserve the same kind of health care that anybody enjoys across this nation.
Tonight, calls for better health care for northern Manitoba.
Oftentimes, when there are funding, they do come with strings attached.
Plus, a new inter-nation trade agreement is reached.
It does take time for people to transition back into a civilian family, a civilian environment.
And a blueprint for success on bail for the Qzan sisters. Good evening, Tansei Anine. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. There's been another devastating fire on the Tatasqueyak Cree Nation in northern Manitoba, this time fatal. RCMP say a house fire on Sunday night in the community claimed the life of a 25-year-old woman. She has not been named. It's the second major blaze on the First Nation in recent months. In February, fire destroyed an apartment building on the reserve, putting a teen and a toddler in hospital and displacing 9 families. In a statement, the chief of the Cree Nation, which is 700 kilometers north of Winnipeg, said this was a tragedy that could have been prevented. Chief Terry Beardy called on the federal government to fulfill its obligations. Beardy says Tatasqueyak scraped together funds for a fire truck in March, but no one was available to train band personnel how to use it. RCMP in the Yukon have laid their first manslaughter charge in connection to an opioid overdose death. Here's Sarah Connors with more.
For the first time in the Yukon, RCMP have charged someone with manslaughter in relation to an overdose death. Yukon RCMP say 32-year-old Jared Skookum has been charged with manslaughter in the death of Stephanie Pye. The 36-year-old Casca and Tlingit woman from Watson Lake was found deceased in Whitehorse in April 2022. It was later determined she died from an opioid overdose. Skookum is already facing trafficking charges related to an investigation into Pye's death. Police in other places like BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan have laid manslaughter charges in relation to overdose deaths. Pye's family says they're not speaking to the media right now, but her sister says they're heartbroken over her death and Skookum needs to be held responsible. Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Well, we want to hear what you think about the stories you've seen to start our show tonight. Here's how to continue the conversation. You can send your emails to news@aptn.ca, or you can leave a comment on aptnnews.ca. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. Follow APTN News to join the conversation and see our latest stories. The Assembly of First Nations and Cindy Blackstock announced today a $23 billion deal to compensate survivors of the First Nations child welfare system. Negotiations on compensation started when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled that Canada discriminated against on-reserve First Nations children in care. But the deal has gone through a number of rocky periods to get to this point. Cindy Blackstock, head of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, joins me now from Ottawa. Cindy, thanks so much for joining us here. 6 months ago, a similar deal to this one was shut down by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. What is different with this settlement agreement?
Well, what the tribunal found is that people who were eligible for $40,000 under its order, some of them were disentitled under the previous FSA. This agreement makes sure that everyone who's entitled to Canadian Human Rights Tribunal compensation will receive that compensation. And it also recognizes the injustices for people who are outside the timeframes of those orders, meaning people from 1991 to 2006. There's been an increase in over $3 billion to make sure that the people who are left behind are now included in this deal.
Now, Cindy, you had a number of concerns about the original deal. Have they addressed those concerns with this deal?
Yeah, we did have a number of concerns, and yes, they are addressed. So key things that we were concerned about before is that children who are placed in a Government of Canada funded placement, like staying with a neighbor, but they had to go there and be separated from their families due to lack of prevention services. Those kids were disentitled under the previous final settlement agreement. They're now included in this one. And also the estates of parents. Those were disentitled under the previous final settlement agreement. That's included here. And we also have more supports for children under the agreement to make sure when they reach the age of majority, there's more supports available to them. So there's been a lot of fixes, and I think now that we have an agreement that recognizes the injustices of all the victims, but will also satisfy the tribunal's orders.
Now, you had just mentioned also previously that this agreement is worth $3 billion more than the original. So what has been added?
So monies for the disentitled victims, about $90 million in supports for children who are reaching the age of majority and will be entitled to compensation. It's really those two kind of key items that make up the bulk of the $3 billion.
And last one for you here, Cindy. When do you see compensation starting to flow?
So there's a bunch of steps that would need to still happen. One is First Nations leadership need to make a decision about this final settlement agreement tomorrow. Then we have to go back to the tribunal and let them know that we heard them in the first order and that there's now fixes in this agreement and everyone will get their compensation. Ask them to make a decision as to whether they feel it satisfies their orders. Then off to federal court and then to get the approval there. So those three pieces, and we're looking at in terms of time frame 9 to 12 months.
All right. Well, Cindy, we appreciate you bringing us this update here. We thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me, Daryl.
The Assembly of First Nations' latest Special Chiefs Assembly kicked off in Ottawa on Monday. Day one began with a late afternoon grand entry and with the honoring of a star blanket to a visibly moved Julie Black. She received the honor for changing the lyrics of "O Canada" to "A Home on Native Land" at the NBA All-Star Game in February. APTN National Chief Roseanne Archibald gave her opening remarks, talking about the completion of a draft action plan to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. According to Archibald, the Chiefs will be pushing the idea of consent.
And as you all know, an important part of the UNDA is free, prior, and informed consent. And consent is key. Consultation is not enough. We need true co-development. Governments alone, colonial governments, they cannot decide on the future of our lands and waters.
Well, today marks 1 week that the Qzan sisters have been on bail after they were released from custody pending the outcome of a judicial review into their 30-year incarceration. Their return to society came with detailed bail plans that could become the norm. Leanne Sanders takes a closer look.
There always has to be a first case, and those first cases are often kind of special cases.
Deanna Harris is the Regional Director for Legal Aid in Yorkton. She worked alongside Innocence Canada's James Lockyer in securing Odelia and Narissa Quewezance's release from custody after 3 decades in the justice system.
It does take time for people to transition back into a civilian family, a civilian environment.
But the judge gave Legal Aid a blueprint.
He laid out a number of very specific things, including how are you going to address potential employment or financial stability? How are you going to address a transition back into a family home? How are you going to address counseling, cultural counseling?
Harris approached Yorkton Tribal Council and the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations to help come up with Odelia and Narissa's bail plans, which includes getting driver's licenses so they can take part in family life, go to counseling, and get jobs.
It's often just very general. If there's a program that is available, you will take it. But we were able to make it pretty specific because we contacted the service providers directly.
Harris believes this case will help lawyers help their clients in other cases. And Harris also believes with the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system, there will be more wrongful conviction cases down the road.
We know that these cases exist. Our justice system deals with so many people every day that we have to understand that it's impossible for these cases not to exist. The justice system makes mistakes. That's why this ministerial review process is in place. That's why the law is being changed around the process, because it's very cumbersome and it takes a long time.
Harris says the ultimate goal is to have Odelia living happily with her family and for Narissa to contribute to society in the way she wants to by helping marginalized people and women in her community. The ministerial review deciding their fate could take years before it's complete. The sisters were found guilty of second-degree murder in 1994 for the death of Anthony Joseph Dolph. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
All right, we have to put a pause on the news for a moment, but still to come, a new project in the Northwest Territories aims to bring more journalism to the North.
Bring your outdoor gear. We're going to be out and about. And I thought, yes.
Welcome back to APTN National News. A group of First Nation leaders from Manitoba were in Ottawa on Monday. They want to draw attention to critical nursing shortages in their communities. At a press conference, leaders said 11 First Nations in the province have declared states of emergency due to nursing shortages and other issues. They claim community members are being refused proper medical care, with preventable deaths being the result. Manitoba Kiwetnawi Ogamaganak Grand Chief Garrison Satie said their people deserve the same quality of health care as other Canadians.
But we're here to say our people matter too. Our people, remote First Nations, deserve the same kind of health care that anybody enjoys across this nation. When we have to see our chiefs bury their people, somewhere along the way, someone has to be held accountable.
And a group of First Nations from Ontario were also in Ottawa on Monday to announce a new inter-nation trade agreement. The Association of Iroquois and Allied Indians, or AIAI, represents 7 different First Nations. At Monday's press conference, they announced an agreement for taking over control of their own economic development. AIAI Grand Chief Joel Abram said too often Ottawa dictates how economic development programs are run.
Oftentimes, when there are funding, they do come with strings attached, and a lot of times it ties it back to the Canada delegating authority to First Nations rather than recognizing their inherent jurisdictions. And so those are the kind of things that we vehemently oppose, because we do intend to exercise our jurisdiction.
While Northerners are known for their storytelling, they aren't necessarily the ones telling them. But a new journalism training program being offered in Inuvik, Northwest Territories, is hoping to change just that. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs brings you that story.
Newsrooms in the north are saturated with journalists from the south. Many stay briefly and then move on to bigger centers. But the Northern Journalism Training Institute is hoping to change that. This week kicks off a boot camp style course aiming to inspire participants to tell their own stories the way they know they should be told in the north.
They're working with equipment and they get to work with software from the beginning, so that they have all 4 weeks to be practicing it and using it. And we're using like open source software. You know, we're not using cost barrier equipment like
Haida and Northern journalists and project lead Kayla Jefford Moore says along with cultivating research skills and applying reporting skills for different mediums, participants gain an understanding of media literacy.
Like, what are your rights as a journalist? You know, what are you allowed to shoot? What is consent? You know, what are some of the legal jargon of like off the record, on background, you know, things like that. As well as talking about what the people you're interviewing and what their rights are and what your rights might be as someone who's being interviewed.
The 4-week program is being held in Inuvik on Inuvialuit and Gwich'in homelands. Participant Monica Lorraine Dillon already works in content creation for Western Arctic Youth Collective and is taking the training to build skills in podcast production.
That there are facts out there, but there's not a lot of truth out there. And like with journalism, it's really important to make sure there's truth to the facts. And we do have a lot of non-Indigenous people reporting on Indigenous communities, a lot who aren't trauma-informed or even know the people in the community. So it's coming from either more of an opinion or biased piece.
Around a dozen participants from the NWT will learn from guest speakers and work placements. Like Julie Beaver, whose background is in counseling and on-the-land wellness, but who has recently decided to change careers.
Bring your outdoor gear. We're going to be out and about. And I thought, yes, you know, that's what I like. I'm more of a hands-on person. That's what most Indigenous people are. We want to get out there. We want to experience, you know, things. We don't want to be just sitting in the classroom. And so that was great to hear.
The free training is in partnership with Journalists for Human Rights and supported by Google News Initiative. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
We have to take a pause one more time here on the show. Our photo of the day and weather are next, plus calls for more Indigenous music on the airwaves.
Puis on fait aucune place à ces gens-là, tu sais, qui nous ont permis de nous établir ici.
Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. And this one might be the cutest photo of the day we've had in a while. This is adorable Chelsea Jane Lee pictured in the Stanley Cup. Chelsea was here at APTN headquarters in Winnipeg this past weekend when the Stanley Cup was here visiting the set of Hockey Night in Canada in Cree. Oh, that's such a good photo. You can send your photos to share@aptn.ca for the chance to be our next photo of the day. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Starting on the East Coast, 3 degrees in St. John's and 12 in Halifax. -8 in Qzan and 2 degrees in Happy Valley Goose Bay. 7 degrees in Quebec City and 9 in Montreal. 8 degrees in Toronto and 2 in North Bay. -1 in Wawa and -4 in Sioux Lookout. -8 in Churchill and clear and -7 in Thompson. Barons River is looking at 0 degrees and Winnipeg is looking at -3. -7 and some snow in Swift Current and -6 in North Battleford. -2 in Meadow Lake and -2 in snow in Stony Rapids. As we head west, 3 degrees in Fort McMurray and 2 in snow in Grand Prairie. 0 in Edmonton and 3 degrees in Calgary. 10 degrees in Vancouver and 5 in clear in Quesnel. 6 degrees in Sandspit and 2 in Fort Nelson. Beaver Creek's looking at -1 and Rock River's looking at -3. Norman Wells looking at -1 and 2 degrees in clear in Fort Simpson. 1 degree in Fort McPherson and -7 in Colville Lake. -21 in Cambridge Bay and -14 in Arviat. -25 in Resolute and -10 in Iqaluit. We're asking to be heard. Musicians in Quebec are saying Indigenous music needs to have more airtime. They're now demanding a 5% quota of Indigenous music in radio stations across Canada. Amelia Fournier has the story.
The word Kashtin means tornado in the Innu language. which is fitting since the Innu folk rock duo took the mainstream media world by storm in the 1980s. But Florent Vallant of Cashton says in the early 90s, something shifted.
On était rendu dans les palmarès, tout ça, en 1990, mais à la crise d'Oka, ils nous ont retiré des ondes. Parce que pour eux, notre musique pouvait être dangereuse. Puis ils nous ont retiré pendant la crise, nous disant qu'ils vont nous remettre par après. Chose qui n'est jamais arrivée encore. C'est pour ça qu'on fait la demande aujourd'hui, pour qu'on puisse être reconnu.
Fast forward to 2023. This group, made up of First Nations musicians, leaders, and non-Indigenous allies in Quebec, still sees a gap.
Ce serait tout à fait dommage qu'on nous connaisse plus, qu'on nous connaisse pas. Ce serait le temps qu'on nous connaisse.
They're asking the CRTC to implement a 5% quota of Indigenous music radio airtime. A public consultation and survey conducted last summer found almost 95% of respondents supported this idea.
Il y a des jeunes artistes qui ont juste besoin qu'on finance leur projet pour marcher dans les pas de Flora.
Popular Quebec artist Émile Bilodeau is not Indigenous, but he's sick of how Indigenous artists are treated in his province.
On part avec le cash, nous autres, là, les francophones. Là. Les radios, c'est beaucoup de sous. Puis on fait aucune place à ces gens-là, tu sais, qui nous ont permis de nous établir ici.
Florent Vallant's son, Mathieu Mackenzie, is also a musician.
On a de la misère à aller dans les radios, dans les autres radios.
He runs Makusha Music, Inc., a production company on their territory of Weshat Nakmanu Tanem, and sees an abundance of Indigenous talent firsthand.
On a beaucoup d'artistes émergents dans la communauté, dans les communautés au Québec, puis pas juste au Québec, à travers le Canada. On nous entend pas assez.
According to a 2021 study by ADZISC, a Quebec Music Association, Indigenous artists are, quote, nearly absent, end quote, from airwaves and get less than 1% of radio airtime in Quebec. Last year, Anishinaabe artist Samian was booted off a festival lineup for not having enough French content to play at a festival, kickstarting a discussion about inclusivity and diversity in the music scene.
On défend tous les artistes producteurs autochtones de musique autochtone.
But Mackenzie is optimistic this attitude is quickly fading from institutions.
Je pense que les festivals, les radios, les diffuseurs culturels vont donner de plus en plus de place aux artistes autochtones, puis de le faire dans leur propre langue. Puis je pense moi, je vois cette lumière-là. Je le vois, je le sens, je le vis parce que je suis dans le milieu culturel. Puis je sens l'appui des gens, puis l'ouverture des gens.
In an email statement to APTN, the CRTC says they will examine their recommendations and start, quote, a process of consultation, end quote, which is music to Florent Vallant's ears.
On demande d'être écouté, d'être entendu. C'est ce que je voulais dire.
Emilia Fournier, APTN National News, Montreal.
All right, that's all we have for you tonight on APTN National News. For more info on any of our stories from tonight, you can check out our website, aptnnews.ca. For all of us here, I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you so much for joining us. Miigwech, Kinanaskamitin. Have a great night.